So, welcome to Ignite. Welcome to, welcome to compliance and patch management for Linux and Unix with System Center. Oh, sorry, I forgot the introduction. My name is Thorsten Henking. I'm a senior premier field engineer within Microsoft's global business support based out of Germany. And today with me is Russ Ernst. Hey, Russ.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Russ Ernst. I'm with Lumention, and I'll give more of a deeper introduction in a little bit.
Okay. So, why is this session? Well, it's a really good question. Why is a Microsoft System Center support guy doing a session on managing Linux, on patching and compliance stuff? I think there are two main reasons for doing this. The first reason is this, and I guess maybe all of you have seen this often during this session. So we are investing so much in the Linux functionality of Azure, of Hyper-V. We're adding Linux support to all of our System Center products. We are partnering with Docker. We added CoreOS to the Azure Gallery. And this implies that we need centralized tools to manage third-party operating systems. And last but not least, the second, and for me it's the most important reason doing a session on this is we have to make also the Linux world a little bit safer. But do we really need patch management for Linux operating systems? I guess one of the most common myths around the last 10 years was that Linux operating systems are safe out of the box. Well, that's not true. We take a look at this slide, and this is really the second reason to doing a session on Linux and Unix patch management compliance. We have seen so many attacks in the last months, starting with shell shock, go ahead with Heartbleed, Poodle attacks, and we are not talking about desktop attacks. These attacks are all data center targeted, and that's the reason why doing a session on Linux and Unix patch management, and this is the reason why it's so important to talk about this. So let's take a look at a number here. So 25% of all Ops Manager installations monitors Linux and Unix computers. What does this mean? That means that we have hundreds of thousands of computers that have to be managed, and that really shows and describes the need for a centralized instance to patch this computer and to monitor this computer if they are compliant or not. Before we go into the software update management stuff, I know this is a session about patching, but you will see some tools during the demos that I have developed to make the demos more handy and to trigger actions on a Linux SCCM client. So treat this, please, as a bonus content, and hopefully, I guess, you will like them. And the best is they are available now for free during MSCN block. So let's take a look at the first demo. Oh, sorry. I'm a little bit nervous this morning, but it's full house here. So consider the following scenario. Contoso's first level support needs access to the log file on the Linux computer for troubleshooting purpose. These guys aren't allowed to access this Linux computer, and they don't have a clue about mastering the command line. So there are several ways to read the log file on a Linux computer. So tail might be Linux admin's first choice. You can use SCP to do a secure copy to a Windows computer of the log file, or we can share out the file via CIFS from the Linux box, but I guess the security department are not happy with it. Any other ideas? So what is the best way to read a SCCM client log file? Do we have any SCCM guys here in the room? What tool would you use? CMTrace, perfect. So why not use it? And this brings me now to my first demo. So normally, just want to show you the pain you have if you want to read a log file with tail. A Linux admin would use this tool. So it's pretty hard to find a deployment ID in here or to troubleshoot the actions that are going on the client. So what I've done is, as I stated before, I developed some custom client actions. And these client actions, you are able to show the log files, trigger a policy cycle on a Linux client, can trigger a hardware inventory, and this all from the config manager console. So it fits the one console approach we have. What I've seen from my support work is that IT departments have to do more work to administer more computers with less people. So, and it's not uncommon that the Windows guys get some Linux machines to manage. And for these guys, I developed these console extensions. So, and with this, I'll show you how it works. And to make sure that this is not a fake, I will show you that it's real time. I trigger a hardware inventory on my client. And you can see here, hardware inventory was started, and this is real time. So it could be a very good way for a Windows admin to do troubleshooting on a Linux computer here. Also, these are client-based actions. These actions are done on a per client base. I also have developed actions for a collection base. So you can trigger a policy cycle or a hardware inventory cycle on a complete collection. This could be interesting for bulk deployments of the SCCM client on Linux computers. These are very flexible to customize, and yes, hopefully you can use it for your work. And as I stated before, they are available now for download through an MSCN blog. And yeah, I'm happy if I can get some feedback about this. And I'm still developing. I will release every month a new part of this that could be helpful for administering the Linux servers. But now, let's go into software update management. As I stated before, software update management is important even for Linux computers. If we take a look at the software update management part from a Windows side, you can see all the things you can do with Configuration Manager. So you can automatically download patches, you can deploy these patches through maintenance windows, you can report all the patch compliance. But for Linux, we can only use native software distribution for deploying patches. So why is it so hard to patch a Linux computer? And before we go into the first software update management demo, what do you think is the biggest problem we might face when we are talking about patching a Linux system? So we have a thing called enterprise distributions in the Linux space, which means you have to pay for software maintenance, you have to pay for software updates, and you need a second repository to pull down these updates. The biggest problem is the dependency hell. So take a look at these dependencies. We are talking about a little RDP client, and this little RDP client has 5 dependencies we have to take care about. So seems like a nightmare, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and you will see a few solutions in this session how to get rid of this dependency hell. So let's start with a demo part, and I've prepared 3 demo scenarios for you. And we are starting with scenario 1. So, well, if we reach this scenario, remember the high dependencies. So why deploy a single patch with SCCM? It's pretty simple. Fix a specific security issue. Remember the data center targeted attacks I've shown before. All these attacks brings a lot of trouble into the safe Linux world, and this is a simple reason why it's valuable to deploy a single patch with Configuration Manager. The most common answer I got when I talked to a Linux admin, I was also a UNIX admin for about 10 years, is, well, I don't need SCCM, I can do this with a small shell script. Okay, but your small shell script, is it able to report hardware inventory? Is it able to install a patch during a defined time frame? It's known as a maintenance window. Mostly I got no answer on this. So let's start with a native install of an individual patch. Okay. So what I do now is I create a collection, and this is a real benefit of using Configuration Manager. So I can pull together all computers I need to patch, and I can do this based on the hardware inventory information. So with this, I create a collection which is based on the hardware inventory information, and it should contain all SSL, all computers that have an SSL component installed. Just zoom it into here. So in this case, the installed applications hardware inventory class is a good friend of mine. Check incremental updates. Just give him a second to evaluate the collection membership. Here we go. And as you can see here, there are 2 Linux computers member of this collection now, because they have OpenSSL installed. Then I go over to my software library. I create a software package. This package contains source files. Bless you. Choose the RPM for this. And in this specific case, I'm using an RPM-UVH, so I just want to update an already installed RPM package here. So I want this, whereas not a user is logged on. There we go. I create a deployment. Target this to the collection I've created before. And I want this as soon as possible because it is a security issue I have to fix. Just give him a second to deploy this package. Did I miss? No. Okay, it takes a second because my laptop has to run 10 virtual machines here. Okay. And with this, go over to my clients. Here comes the benefit of the CM trace log file reading. So I can use CM trace and can highlight on a deployment ID. So I'm able to see in real time if the policy arrives on the client. So I can enter the deployment ID and CM trace will highlight the line for me and makes troubleshooting or investigating some stuff very, very handy in this case here. So I trigger a policy cycle. The client will pull down the policy, evaluate the policy bodies, pull down the content, and then will install this content, this package for me, and my client is secured. Well, if we leave this scenario one here as a small overview, for content distribution we are using configuration manager, content distribution infrastructure. The downside is that we cannot automatically resolve the patch dependencies here. The cool thing, as I stated this before, in using configuration manager on this is that we can obey configuration manager maintenance windows and that we can use inventory data to target this specific fix to a computer that has this issue. That brings me to scenario 2. Read the last line. All servers should install all updates that are recommended by SUSE's security advisory team. In this case, I'm using a SUSE Linux Enterprise server here. So it's SUSE, but it could also be a Red Hat, or it could also be a CentOS, whatever. What do you think? Is it possible to install all patches that are released by SUSE's security advisory team within a single command line? Remember this patch dependency stuff we had before. Normally, and this was my experience in the past, due to this count of dependencies we have to take care of, is that Linux system, and especially if we're talking about critical Linux system like Tomcat application server or this stuff, patches are deployed very, very rarely to these Linux boxes. But times are really changed. So IT departments have to manage more computers with less count of people. So they have to use tools like Configuration Manager for patching these computers. To be honest, what you see next, it's a little bit like patching with a watering can, but your computers are secured. And I show you how to achieve this. So next scenario is keep your computer secure. And for this, I create another collection. And, okay, I want to keep my computer secure, so I add a direct rule for all computers that contains / in the name. So now we'll create another package. With a standard program. Install all patches. And this is the whole magic. So I just deploy a program which runs the built-in package manager. In this case, a zipper, and I tell zipper, hey, go to your repository and install all patches that are recommended by SUSE Security Advisory Team. Little downside here is, again, it's like patching with a watering can. But what I achieve is that I'm keeping my computer secure, install all patches, and don't have to take care of the dependencies we have on a Linux computer. So with this command line, the computer goes to the repository and downloads the content. This repository could be a SUSE online repository or a Red Hat repository. Or you can also set up a local mirror of this repository so the client don't have to go to the internet to pull down this content. I don't want to bother you with software deployment. So again, this is a good way to install all the patches. But we have to wait until a new hardware inventory arrives to see if the patches are installed or not. Also here, a small overview. You can see the automatically resolve patch dependencies is checked. We can obey configuration manager maintenance windows, which is a real benefit from my point of view to install software updates in a defined time frame. But we have to go to a SUSE repository, even it is on the internet or it is a local repository. And this brings me to scenario 3. And what you see here is a very, very custom solution. I've built this for a customer scenario I've worked with. And our approach was to keep all the computers secure with SCCM, leveraging the built-in package manager. But there was one problem, and this was the Linux admin. So we were not allowed to patch these Linux computers. So what we have done is we built a custom solution around this with some reporting, took these reports, gave it to his boss, and said, hey, your Linux computers are not secure. Go to the guy and tell him he had to patch his computers. So after one day, all computers have installed these patches, so no problem anymore. And this brings me to scenario 3, which is keep your server secure and know what was installed. And in this case, and if you are interested, I can share this out to you. I use a small script, and this script runs also a zipper, pulls down the information of available patches, and writes this information back to a file. And with this file, there's another friend of mine who came into the game, and it's Orchestrator. So with Orchestrator or service management automation, so these runbooks are also running on service management automation. What I've done here is that Orchestrator picks up a file when a computer puts this file onto a share, reads information, and put it back to Configuration Manager. And Configuration Manager has some nice and handy reports. So we can use the Configuration Manager reporting feature. Just search for Linux. Takes a second. Here we go. So we can get a report of a host for a specific date where I've run this. And you can get a report with all the needed information for your admin. So we have the computer who needs to be patched. We have the patch packet which is available or not installed on the client. And we also have the classification. These are the available patches. After populating this patch information from the Linux client, Orchestrator does a second check. So the result of this is takes a second again. So that we get a second report after a second scan cycle with a difference between pre and post patching. So we are able to get a look into what was installed. And this is a very, very custom solution, but it takes not so much work to implement this and to get this information. And it also works with Yum or Tab, whatever your package manager is, no problem. So maybe a good way to see what's going on your Linux computers. Also here, a small overview. And yes, so the same as it was for scenario 2. But for now, we are able to see what was installed and what is missing on the Linux computer. And that brings me to my last demo part, or my last part of this session before I'm heading over to Russ, is compliance management. Compliance management is important even for these Linux servers. So if you take a look at this scenario, so you want to ensure that special security settings are made on your Linux boxes. Your manager wants a report of this. So how can we achieve this? Well, let me explain how a Linux system is configured. As an example, the configuration for daemons, which is similar like services on a Windows system, is stored in plain text files. So we can easily modify this plain text files here. And like for a Windows operating system, there are security benchmarks available. And in this security benchmarks, you can see what settings have to be made on a best practice base to keep your computer secure. So with this benchmark information, I've set up this compliance management scenario here. And for this, we also have a custom solution. So I run a compliance check. And this compliance check, let me just do this again. That's no problem. With this compliance checks, Orchestrator came again into the game. So Orchestrator queries a database which holds the information of this security benchmarks. So we have 3 tables in a special database where this security information is stored. So the settings, how to audit the settings, and all the other stuff. And with this, Orchestrator pulls information down of the database and performs some checks on the Linux client here. And then he writes back the information back to the database. And with this information, we are also able to run a report on Configuration Manager. which gives us an idea about what's going on. And in this demo scenario, I only use 3 checks. So I'm checking for NFS, DHCP, and printing services. So we get back the information from the Linux client. And again, this is really custom, I know, but it's about getting a view into this dark hole you might see when you are managing Linux computers as a Windows admin. So it's just, something like a solution accelerator to see what's going on there. And it's really easy to develop this and to drive this further and make this more handy or whatever. This was one compliance solution. And also, I guess I have a lot of friends here. So there's another friend, and is PowerShell desired state configuration. So with PowerShell desired state configuration, we are also able to perform checks on a Linux computer. So it all starts with a connect to the Linux box you want to check. And before I start checking, I have to define what I want to check. So in this case, I want to ensure that there's a text file available on my Linux client under the TMP directory, and it should contain Go Hawks. So if I want to ensure this, I just start the configuration. Here we go, and as you can see, it's very, very fast to do this check on a Linux computer. So let's go to the Linux box. There we go. There's my text file. It contains Go Hawks. Okay, but what about if I'm a Bears fan? So I modify this file and say, okay, I'm not a Hawks fan, I'm a Bears fan. So save this file. At PowerShell desired state configuration is a Seahawks fan. So we test the configuration, and also here it was just a millisecond to get the result, and it stated, okay, the setting is wrong here. So I start again the configuration. Also here, it finished within under 1 second. As you can see, PowerShell desired state configuration is a Seahawks fan. So this brings me to the end of my part here. Again, what you have seen is some custom solutions. I was trying to give you an idea how to deal with Linux computers. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me after the session, or you will find me at our Linux booth this afternoon. So, and then I will hand over to Russ, who brings in the extended functionality with our partner solution. Thanks.
Thank you, Torsten. So as Torsten mentioned, we also have some additional functionality that we can bring within System Center Configuration Manager with some partner solutions. So as I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Russ Ernst. I'm a Director of Product Management at Lumention. Lumention, before I get into the System Center extension itself, I just want to talk a little bit about what we do. Lumention is a heat software company. We are an application development gold partner with Microsoft. We're also part of the Enterprise Cloud Alliance with Microsoft. And Lumention has been in business since 1991 with a deep history and heritage in patch management and vulnerability remediation solutions. And we actually started working with Microsoft on developing this extension into System Center back with the release of Configuration Manager 2012 SP1, when Microsoft released support for a native client on Linux and Unix. So we were able to partner with them to develop a couple of solutions. Since that time, we first developed a solution for managing Linux and Unix patches through Configuration Manager. We also have a separate solution that does third-party application Windows desktop patching through System Center. Two different solutions, but I'll spend the rest of the time here talking about our extension into System Center for the Linux and Unix patch management. So as Torsten mentioned at the beginning, a real complete patch management solution through System Center really requires three components. It's the ability to auto-download all of those patch components, the ability to deploy those patch updates to the environment, and then the ability to report on those. And Torsten gave really good demonstrations on some ways to, with the native client for System Center, which allows just for the ability for dropping a script and doing some extended hardware and software inventory to kind of work around some of those other issues with some customized scripts and whatnot. So what we wanted to do was actually partner with Microsoft to kind of plug a couple of those holes to bring more of a Windows-centric update management process to managing the Linux and Unix servers. And so what we did was we provided an integrated extension for System Center. So that provides the Linux and Unix server patching into basically an update list that can be deployed to those managed servers. We provide those automated patch downloads. So we're actually monitoring many of the different repositories for Linux and Unix, as well as Mac updates, and providing that into Configuration Manager. And then we also provide some aggregated compliance reporting. So complete out-of-the-box reporting once the system has been installed and integrated. From an supported operating system perspective, we handle the most prevalent and targeted platforms within the Linux and Unix space, as well as Macs. So on the Linux side, you see the Red Hat, SUSE Linux, CentOS, Oracle Linux. And on the Unix side, we see the Solaris, IBM AIX, HPUX, and then also the Mac OS desktops, since really under the covers, Macs are just Unix-based. We can handle that through this extension also. I want to talk a little bit about just a high-level architecture view of how this system is configured. In order to have that single pane of glass of reporting for both your Windows patching and your Linux and Unix patching, with the Lumention solution for Linux and Unix patch management, what we call Patch Manager Data Center, it really requires a separate application server to be installed side by side with System Center Configuration Manager. And the main goal of that is to provide that automatic patch download repository. So it provides a centralized repository. And it also provides some centralized credentials management. That application server also acts to communicate from a centralized location within your environment to a couple different locations. First off, out to the Lumention Cloud, what we call our Global Subscription Service, or GSS. And that's where we can do the Lumention licensing management as well as the update metadata management. Lumention essentially acts as a centralized metadata repository for all of these supported platforms, where we can normalize that metadata into a consistent experience through System Center. That application server also communicates out with all the supported platform vendors, so we can, from a centralized location, go out to the Red Hat location or the Oracle Linux location to pull down all those update remediation binaries themselves, and then also do the license validation with those specific partner vendors. Okay, before I get into the demo itself and show a little bit about how the Lumention Patch Manager Data Center solution looks within System Center, I did want to give just a quick overview of what we call the patch management workflow. And this is it's a generic patch management best practice that we like to talk about from the Lumention side that's really applicable to Linux and Unix patch management as well as your Windows patch management, just to kind of show the holistic view that we've taken when it comes to taking a patch management approach for the Linux and Unix data center servers through System Center Configuration Manager. And it really comes down to 5 steps, what we call the discover, assess, prioritize, remediate, and report. And the way we define discovery within System Center is the ability to go out and look for those endpoints that already have a System Center client installed on them, where we can drop then a separate agent component. Now again, as I mentioned, the native client for System Center has the ability to do some hardware and software inventory and the ability to drop a script, as Torsten demoed. But we do need a separate agent component on those Linux and Unix servers to do the full patch assessment and deployment, and what we call the remediation piece. So we provide an out-of-the-box package to drop that assessment and remediation component onto the endpoint. I'll also show how we can do a security assessment from within the console, where it lists out all the different advisories that are bundled together and made available through the Linux and Unix partners. We'll also do a prioritization based off of an individual endpoint as well as a group of endpoints. Then we can actually initiate a complete remediation on a package-by-package basis or an advisory-by-advisory basis, and then finish up with some reporting. And we have a few different ways we can do some compliance reporting. So with that, I'll move over to the Lumention Patch Manager Data Center demonstration. So first and foremost, what you'll see here is under the software library, under the packages, as I mentioned, we provide this prepackaged System Center package that includes the Lumention Patch Manager agent. Again, this is that specific agent that provides the assessment and remediation component out to the managed Linux and Unix servers. So that can be deployed directly out to any of the Linux and Unix servers that already have the System Center client installed. That's part of that discovery phase. Next, we'll want to go in to look at some of the assessment itself. And you can see here we've got a new node that's been added into the software library workspace titled Lumention Patch Manager Data Center. And right now what I want to do is look at all the critical and not superseded updates provided through the different supported vendors. You can see this is a pretty large list of different individual advisories. And this has already been filtered down to the critical and not superseded based off of this criteria. But I could also open up this search. This is just what's been applicable for the managed servers in my environment today. But I could also take a wider look at this and just take a look at all the different software that's been replicated down to this environment. You start to see beyond just SUSE, actually, what do I have? I have 11,000 different packages that have already been, the metadata has already been synchronized with this configuration manager server. And you can also see from a high-level view, just from this list, complete list of all the different advisories, I can drill in, find more information about this specific advisory, and you see a high-level view of which of the endpoints in my environment are applicable and not patched, or applicable and patched for that specific update. So that's a high-level assessment view. If I wanted to do a more deep-level prioritization, I can then look into the Assets and Compliance workspace. Again, you see this new node show up for Patch Manager Data Center. I can take a look at just of the endpoints that I have that now have the Patch Manager agent installed on them. You can see there are the 3 SUSE Linux endpoints here, servers. And I want to drill into this one here, this SUSE 11 server here. And this gives more detail about this specific server, as well as a filtered list of the advisories just for this specific server. And again, you can see at a high level which ones are applicable and patched or applicable and not patched. This is a highly unpatched server. From here, when I also want to do my prioritization, I can also do some additional searches if I wanted to look for an OpenSSL vulnerability, for example. I can update that view, and now I have a much shorter list of the OpenSSL advisories specific for this endpoint. And then from here, what I can do is also select these individual ones for deployment right away. And this is going to walk through a complete, this takes me to the next step, the deployment stage. This allows me to rename this specific job. I can change the deployment time for this specific job. And I also have the ability to do some more detailed deployment options. For example, if this was a kernel update, I could force a reboot after this specific deployment. And then if this actually was a desktop Linux device, I could also notify any users that might be logged onto that, provide some reboot notification options, and then a summary before I actually send that deployment out. So I've done a discovery, assessment, prioritization, remediation. The last step, and probably the most important step actually, is going to be in the compliance reporting. And so what I want to do is go down to the, actually one more thing before I get into reporting is, this is just a view based off of just the single Linux endpoint, but we also have the ability to group multiple endpoints by machine type, whether it's virtual or physical. I can drill into this and see a higher level view of all the different Linux endpoints. This would break out by OS type as well. So if we were managing some SUSE boxes, some Red Hat boxes, some Mac boxes, I could do that all from this automatic grouping, or I can create some custom groups for within here. This allows me the ability to see, again, another filtered view of just these specific groups, and I can also do a deployment from here as well. So just another way of doing a prioritization of the updates. So now going on to the monitoring and the reporting. Again, from the monitoring workspace, you can see, again, the Lumention Patch Manager Data Center node has been added. You see a few different reporting options that we have out of the box. You can see that these are very straightforward, not a lot of configuration required to run these reports. This is a generic vulnerability analysis report. And you can see very quickly I have a report that I can then export to CSV that gives a vulnerability status based off of the number of advisories applicable to those machines. We also have what we call enhanced reports, and these leverage the SSRS reporting engine within System Center and allows me to very quickly provide a list of advisories that are applicable to these specific machines in the environment. What's powerful about this report too is this is kind of a two-way report that I can use to take this report back up to my executive management team and say, this is proving my patch compliance for the number of endpoints in my environment. But also I can take the same report and drill into it here. And in some cases, you might find that there's a Windows server administrator and maybe a Linux and Unix server administrator. And sometimes that Linux and Unix server administrator doesn't want the Windows administrator to change the Linux and Unix box. Might happen. But this is an option where you can actually provide the same report and say, well, if the Linux and Unix administrator is still responsible for updating that machine, here's the report that you need to pass in order, these are the updates that need to be applied in order for us as an organization to pass our security compliance requirement. So it's a pretty powerful report. We also provide this in a native RDL format. So if you have a SQL Server expert that knows how to use Report Builder, you can also use the same report to customize out for your environment. You also see we provide a high-level dashboard that gives more information about the overall vulnerability state for the environment, as well as some of the licensing information. This is a pretty powerful tool. So it's actually built off of years of experience that Lumention has had with our patch and remediation standalone product. And so you actually see a lot more information here from a product information perspective, full robust technical support. We can have some feature enhancements directly from within the product itself, as well as the ability to, again, monitor all my subscription updates and check on all the communication back from the extension itself out to the Lumention Global Subscription Service. So with that, I'm going to go back to the slides and do, again, just a little bit of a high-level summary. Just to revisit, again, this is an extension into Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager 2012 SP1 or higher. We do have some additional system requirements because of this component is really, it's monitoring many different platforms and doing some of that replication and building up a local repository. So we do require a dedicated server for doing that patch content mirroring. We also require that additional Linux and Unix patch agent to be deployed out to those managed servers for the detection and deployment. We also saw that through the demo, there were some separate role-based access controls. So again, if you wanted to, you could have a specific user that only has reporting capability and doesn't have the ability to do any deployments. Again, if you have that separation in your environment between the Windows administrator and the Linux and Unix server administrator, you can set up some role-based access controls around that. And then we have that separate group model within the extension. Going forward, we're looking to synchronize the System Center collections with the Lumention groups, as well as also respecting the System Center maintenance windows. I showed in the demo for the deployment the ability to schedule the deployment for the Linux and Unix updates. We also have the ability to create what in our UI we call hours of operation, which are essentially analogous to the System Center maintenance windows. It's a separate function that needs to be set up today, but it has the same functionality, where if you were to schedule a deployment, it would only go if it was falling within the specific set hours of operation. Finally, if you're looking for more information, you can always head out to the Lumention.com website, lumention.com/system-center, for more additional information. I'll leave that up there for just one more minute. I thought I heard some clicks. Bueno. All right, so finally I want to do a solution overview. To be consistent with all of the other scenarios that were presented during this topic, the content distribution is handled all through the dedicated application server, and that's actually a single repository for all the different managed platforms, whether it be Linux, Unix, or the Mac desktops. The servers only really require access to that single centralized repository in your environment. Just so you don't have to have all the individual servers connected out to the internet. We do obey our hours of operation. It's not specifically tied to the configuration manager maintenance windows, so there's a separate step that has to be done there, but we do have the ability to set up some hours of operation. As you saw, there's the pretty comprehensive compliance reporting, as well as we can automatically resolve all those underlying patch dependencies. Each of those advisories obviously has a number of RPMs or packages associated with them, depending on the flavor of Linux or Unix that's being monitored. But we take care of all those underlying dependencies as well, just to make for a very straightforward update deployment process. There really isn't a need to do any inventory data to target those deployments. The deployments are really targeted as an endpoint by endpoint basis, all through the UI, or through a group-by-group basis. If you guys have any other questions, you can feel free to come up here afterwards, and I'll stick around for a little bit. We also have a couple of other folks from Lumention that can talk about in more details about how this solution is provided for our partners. And then we also have the ability, we're also out on the expo floor in booth 260. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Torsten for one final wrap-up.
Yeah, I guess So, okay. Yeah. I guess we have seen a few solutions how to deal with a Linux computer in a heterogeneous environment. So I guess everyone has to figure out what is the best solution for him. So the mentioned solution offers more functionality in reporting and compliance management and stuff. But I also have shown you a few solutions how to deal with patch dependencies and this stuff. So and with this, I think we are finished. Thanks for joining. If you have any questions, again, we are here. I'm also at the Linux booth this afternoon. Feel free to evaluate this session. Yeah, thanks for joining again. Have a good day. Have a good time in Chicago. Thanks.